everyone. Welcome back. I'm back again with an amazing panel. I have Paul, I have Odon, and I have JC. I think you all know them by now. And Odon and we were just having a fantastic discussion about upcoming episodes. We want to talk about the ending of your book about Mecca. Do you just want to fill the audience in, because that'll be a really interesting topic to get back to. It's a very relevant topic.
Okay. Let's spoil everything. So, as you know, I'm writing. I'm almost done. I'm writing a book on Mecca. You have already seen some of its material in our series about Mecca. The book is to be published in French next August, but there will be an English translation. And in the last part of the book, I built upon what we already established in our video series, which is that Mecca wasn't able to sustain anything more than an encampment of nomads. But it could not support a city or even a small city. And we also established that the holy city that is described in the Quran is Jerusalem. And the last part of my book is about based on these very basic facts, trying to understand how Islam was created. And actually, it's quite easy if you look at it from the big picture perspective. Jerusalem was the city of the Quran. It was the city of the Islam of the origins. And we know that around 638, an alliance of Arabs and Jews took the city and they rebuilt the temple there. We have 10 or 12 independent testimonies and sources explaining that something was built on the Temple Mount by this alliance. So we can, from there, we can understand that early Islam was all about Jerusalem, rebuilding the temple and triggering the Messianic times. And we knew that the Messianic times did not happen. Something else happened. The Islam, I would call it the caliphal, or the caliphs Islam emerged instead of the Messianic times. And the whole swindle or the whole lie of Islam is exposed there. Early Islam was all about Jerusalem, but later Islam had almost nothing to do with Jerusalem. So everything was created. The simple facts we established about Mecca are proof enough for the invention of Islam.
Right. You know, this is fantastic, this historical approach, because I believe very much in the historical method. I think that truth must be grounded in history, grounded in verifiable fact. Yesterday, at the moment, I'm doing 3 series. One is on the sources of the Quran. What are the sources of all the narratives, the stories, the myths in the Quran? And I've been doing now several episodes with Usama, going through the Jewish Targums, going through the Talmud, going through various myths and legends from the Zoroastrians, from Persia, from the Jews, from the Christians, from heretics, from Gnostics. And all of these somehow made their way into Islam, and all of these can be traced. And I've been going through that. Usama, who's obviously grew up in Egypt, who was taught Islam and so on, he's blown away by this because he wasn't aware of this. Now we're going through these sources. And we were talking yesterday about how the narrative changes. We were going through the Jewish sources in yesterday's episode, various of the Jewish sources that influenced Islam in terms of the narratives in Islam and as well as the practices. And then I'll go section by section through different religions and regions and so on. But we went through how the story changes, how they've modified the story. And for instance, the age of Khadija, Muslims take it for granted she was 40 years old. But if you actually go to the Islamic sources, there are scholars that have written on these things. And I quoted yesterday, I showed a source where they state that there's no way that a woman had 6 children with Muhammad in the 6th century, was 40 years old. And she said that, in fact, her age comes from the weakest of hadiths. And she was probably 25, maybe she was 35, maybe she was younger, maybe she was older. They give a whole variety of ages, as low as her 20s. Then also they speak of the story of, as one example, the story of Muhammad, who carries the luggage of a woman who's fleeing Mecca because she heard of a warlord called Muhammad who's coming. And they said, no, this story is from not only it's not even a weak tradition, it's a rejected tradition. It's even weaker than Da'if. But Muslims cling on to these, and yet these things, but it shows how they've invented stories, and these have made their way into Islam, and we can show copious examples. I showed several examples yesterday, and there were hundreds I could have drawn from.
Yeah. After the book on Mecca, we have several projects here in France, and one is a book on the sources of the Quran. All these stories, the Jewish, the Gnostics, all the influences. And I would like to add my grain of salt with the exactly what you just mentioned, how the Islamic tradition invented stories, maybe based on a tiny speck of historical reality, but it expanded and it became fantasy, thanks to the vivid imagination of the traditionists.
Yeah.
May I add something? Odon, so the way that you told the story, and it would be great to have episodes with the conclusion of the book as well, with that material.
Yeah.
It sounded a little bit like in the 7th century, then a group of Arabs and Jews, they reconquered the city, they built the 3rd temple, and as a result of that, people started worshipping a guy who never really existed, who could actually be called an image, who denied the Christ. So I don't know, I think I've read that story somewhere.
Yes, something like this, but it's a bit more complex. You see, you have to also to make do with a very, very an oddity within Islam. How come the Prophet Muhammad is not quoted? His name is never written on inscriptions up until the end of the 7th century. And even there, when we find Muhammad, for example, or Muḥammad on inscriptions or coins, we can be sure it's about the prophet,
right?
Because it can mean something else, and this is very, very odd.
Let's give Paul a moment to add his thoughts. He's sitting there very quietly.
No, it's very true what both of you say. One point, I don't want to misquote the gentleman, but Gabriel Said Reynolds has very politely, very delicately pointed out in 1 or 2 places that whenever the Islamic tradition needs a story or needs some facts, somebody always remembers something. There's always the guy there who says, "Oh, I know how old Khadijah was," or I know who this verse refers to. Wherever it's possible for a Quran verse to be explained by a story, somebody is always there with a story, even hundreds of years after the death of Muhammad. So people were there. And one of the best examples I came across of this is when Muhammad had to give some, I think it was camels, to 10 camels to Khadijah's father as part of his wedding proposal, and somebody managed to remember the names of all 10 camels. And you can get these absolutely insane details that somebody remembers somebody's father telling them that their father told them. You can get all these. But whenever one has a real puzzle, whenever you have something in the Quran that can't be solved from imagination alone, then the record is absolutely silent. There's zero, there's nothing. When there's something that you can't just make up, there's no record there at all. So that's both the best example of this, or one of the classic
very
examples,
convenient.
would be the mysterious letters. Nobody knows what the mysterious letters mean. Did nobody think to remember that? All these people who remembered all these other details, nobody even knew what these mysterious, they got forgotten. It says that there are three peoples that are going to be saved besides the believers. They are the Jews, the Christians, and the Sabiun. Nobody's ever prepared to come forward and say who the Sabiun are. There's always left to the matter of speculation and some possibly, but nobody really knows. It would have been very simple for somebody to have asked Muhammad, and then somebody's grandfather's grandfather to have remembered. It's never there.
Once you look into the Sabians, you start to find that this is not remotely Islamic. This is most definitely astrological. It's star, moon worshipping. It is definitely nowhere near Christian. It is occultic. I mean, so the whole, I've been covering that in a different series, and clearly they're not Islamic, but yet the Muslims also have drawn from them and included them as Christian, which leads one to ask too many questions. So they just had to kindly drop that.
You could say, why, for example, does Surah Al-Tawbah, why is that the only surah of the Quran that doesn't have the basmala as its prologue, as its introduction? Again, nobody knows. And so whenever you have these things that you can't just make up a story, there's nothing. And whenever you can make up a story, there is absolutely everything. And I don't think Gabriel Said Reynolds would be so rude as to say so in terms. Yeah. But I think the implication of this is that from a very early stage, the actual memory of Muhammad amounted to zero.
The early sources have very little information, but then sources hundreds of years later have whole pages of description.
My take is that his inner circle were killed off very quickly after the capture of Jerusalem, and anybody who remembered anything, it didn't pay them. It didn't pay them to say to try and correct anyone else's memory, and it was very quickly forgotten.
Right.
But the Quran survived, and then people needed to reconstruct it from almost nothing, and that this happened very, very quickly. Right. That the people were interested in the Quran within probably continuously, certainly within a decade or two, but nobody actually who was interested in the Quran actually remembered anything. So you got this fascinating dichotomy.
Yeah, a couple of things I want to mention as well. A couple of weeks ago, I did a show last week, and someone sent me a paper which I showed, and it discusses the Ethiopic influences. It's an actual legit academic paper, and it's well written, and it discusses academic influences on Islam. Sorry, Ethiopic influences on Islam, right? And it also touches on Yemen. Now, 5 years ago, when I started talking about this was bizarre. This was another, I was out in left field, and now it's starting to become a legitimate area of research. People are starting to talk about it, and then now, just today, there was this, I watched this show by Ahmed Al-Jalad on the Myth Vision podcast. We spoke about that just before we went live. And he's talking about things he's finding in Yemen and the god Shamash, and Shamash was Allah and such. Now, and then he's speaking of Muhammad, the term Muhammad was around from the 6th century, before Muhammad was born, all the way back to, in fact, they were using the term Muhammad hundreds of years prior. Right, if not even thousands. So now suddenly Ahmed Al-Jalad is starting to talk about Yemen. They're starting to talk about the South, about astrological religions, about pagan influences, and how Muhammad is a name that is found within these pagan religions and so on, and Allah. And, so suddenly he seemed very uncomfortable when he was asked certain questions, but clearly the dots are being connected. They're just not, it leaves them very uncomfortable, I think. The standard narrative is under attack, I think, and our work, despite being non-academic, unofficial, I think it's being felt.
What I find very interesting, I saw that clip. I think an excerpt of it was posted by Mel on his Islamic Origins channel, So that's how I can. So I haven't seen the whole thing. I only saw the clip that he posted. But what came across very clearly there, and something that's I think been very clear for a long time, more than a decade, is that the professional academy of scientists, people like Ahmed Al-Jalad and I think Sean Anthony, whose name was mentioned, and various other people, they're a bit snooty about the amateurs. They say, oh, well, we don't really engage with those people, and these people might have other motivations. They're not, none of their work is peer reviewed. And he says, well, we don't really like to talk about them. We don't really like to engage with them in any way. But the professional academy doesn't have any answers for any of this. It's not as though they've got an established conclusion or a consensus that they're willing to defend. Everything that they find is inconsistent with the standard narrative, but they won't look at finding an explanation for it or trying to find any kind of meta narrative. No one is prepared to put their name and say, okay, I think maybe this is how it happened. They won't do that. It's people like Mel and us around here, and a few other people who are prepared to go out and put ideas up, have them tested informally amongst ourselves, decide what works, what doesn't work, what sounds plausible, what somebody else could say, I've got a bit of evidence to support that. We're doing that work, but the professional academy simply, they see that what they're finding is inconsistent with the narrative, but they have no alternative to offer.
You know, it's a pity Usama couldn't make it today because he's off to a birthday party, but because I invited him. But he's been sitting in on a few of my broadcasts, and he was saying I showed him something in Arabic, which he said he's been reading the Quran in Arabic for decades. And he says suddenly because I explained something to him that he had overlooked, he saw words and references and meanings that he wasn't aware of. And we went through those in detail. And he was shocked. And he said, my gosh, I've read this word, I've read this passage hundreds of times over decades. And suddenly you've just shown me that this refers to this or this. So there is more to be discovered. There's definitely a layer that's been placed over this of assumptions. And now we're starting to strip that away, and we're starting to see things that are a little different. I mean, it's challenging, but I think we are starting to uncover something. We're starting to explore avenues that, Odon, we started off, you mentioned the stories in the Quran, right? They come from different sources, from different periods, different geographies, different religions, different cultures. But I've been going through one of the earlier sources in English on that, and that was written in the 1890s. But the information goes back at least a century before that, if not more. So this was well known. You can find scholarship on this in German and English going back to the 1800s, right? And then it started to get formalized in the 1890s, and World War II happened, and then oil was discovered in Arabia, and suddenly we were all friends, right? So, but this has been known and discussed for more than a century. It's only now that we are rediscovering these little facts.
Yeah, I won't say it has been known. For example, I was reading an article, which is almost a book per se, by Robert Kerr on Mecca. Unfortunately, it's in German. So, but it's with translation. Most people can have access to it. It's called the Blauen Blumen von Mecca, the blue flowers of Mecca, and it's his take. It's Robert Kerr's take on the creation of Mecca. He wrote it at least 10 years ago. So lots of stuff has been discovered since. But the thing with Robert is that he uncovers studies that were made 100 years ago, 120 years ago, and sometimes even earlier, that no one knows about, actually.
Right.
And for example, he explains how the stories about Mecca within the Islamic tradition come from three different cores. They have three different origins. One that he think is centered around the Ali character, and it's all about the temple. Another one that will be of a Jewish origin, and a last one that will be a sort of reconstruction and invention with the writing of Hadith. I had never read before this kind of analysis on the stories about Mecca, but they exist. They exist. They have been there since a century or more. And so the thing is, we have a huge we already have a huge pool of studies and hypotheses about the origins of Islam, but they were sort of left behind because no one had access to them.
Well,
but everything is changing with the internet. And,
but we can go back. I mean,
AI
I found sources going back to the 1700s, 1800s, 1900s. And these sources often build on older manuscripts or older research. And sometimes, obviously, it's easier for us to now compile information. We can connect the dots a little easier with the internet in today's age. But people were discussing these things way back then already. So this wasn't that unheard of, you know. Mm-hmm. I mean, Tisdall wrote about this at length in this book, and I'm covering that. So anyway, maybe we should just dive into where we were going to go.
Yeah.
And just talk as we go. But yeah, it's still fascinating. Okay, so I need to lay a bit more groundwork before I get into the book of ELCHASAI, right? So as I said, I'm doing 3 series right now with the practices, the origins of the practices and the narratives within Islam from pagans, from Jews, from you name it, and so on. But now looking at the Gnostic influences within Islam. So what are some of the sources? We're planning to get here to the book of ELCHASAI. Ebionism, this was discussed as well. I discussed that yesterday. Manichaeism, Talmud, Targums, as well as the Apocrypha, right? These are the different Gnostic sources on top of Islam, right? So let's continue. So old snake, new skin. Now, the Quranic verses that mention Jesus' birth, certain miracles, his crucifixion, and other events bear close resemblance to sectarian texts dating as early as the 2nd century, right? The Quran's narratives are not unique to the 7th century. Some of these narratives go back well before, hundreds of years before, if not thousands in some cases. And the model for Islam in the Quran long pre-existed in pseudo-biblical texts and groups, many of which still existed, or the traditions were still alive in the 7th century. All right. This is the one source, one of the sources that I've mentioned. I had this yesterday, and I'm doing a series with Usama on Mondays to talk about this, right, by William Tisdall, right, the original sources of the Quran. Now, the Quran mentions numerous biblical figures. Many of its stories, however, are not found in the inspired Jewish and Christian scriptures. So what is their source, right? Where do these stories come from? Now, this episode, again, is not going to be heavily detailed. I just want to introduce certain ideas, some threads that, put some things on the table, and we'll see how they connect in the near future. But this is from, this stamp here is 1935. This book goes back prior to that. Arabia, the Cradle of Islam, Studies in the Geography, People, and Politics of the Peninsula with an Account of Islam by Reverend S.M. Zwemer, right? Introduction by Reverend James Dennis. And let's see. This is kind of interesting. He lays out this discussion of Islam, some of it which is not very well known right now, even. So he mentions there is no God but Allah, and Muhammad is his apostle. Great, right? Doctrine of revelation, right? Muhammad is the apostle of Allah, the sole channel of revelation, and he abrogates all former revelations. This is well known in the past, right? Now notice he says here, the names of Allah, the essence of Allah. Allah is the absolute unit, like the monad. Allah has 99 names. This is well known, right? Now this book goes back a century or more, right? Notice he goes to Muhammad, who has 201 names. So Muhammad has double the names of Allah. So Muhammad seems to be a little bit more important than Allah. JC, remember we spoke yesterday about how Muhammad has to be the one you worship because there's a certain thing that he does that can only be done by God, and therefore Muhammad has to be God. What was it that Usama mentioned yesterday, JC?
What was it that I can't remember. What I know is Rob Christian at one point pulled up some of the titles used for Muhammad and unpacking those, and they're actually Jesus. Like they put a lot of stuff from Jesus on Muhammad. That is for certain.
Okay, yeah, we covered something. Now he speaks. You have the book and the man, which we know that Jay Smith has spoken of a lot, and then they speak of other authorities. You have the Quran, right? And you have Wahi al-Matlu, blah, 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 by tradition, okay? The book, the man. And then, of course, other authority, the records of what Muhammad did, the Sunnat al-Fa'il, the records of what Muhammad commanded, the Sunnat al-Qawl. Now, notice the precepts or the laws, right? Al-Qawl, now, we spoke yesterday about Ka'el, which, long story short, watch yesterday's episode. Ka'el, not just the name of Superman's father, but it's also the name of a pagan deity, okay? El being a way to refer to the most high God, right? The highest deity in the pantheon, and Ka'el being, so a pagan deity. So these are the sunnat of the Ka'el, which is the pagan deity, if you want to link it directly back into the past. Obviously, you can have a name today that is the same as a name from a long time ago. It doesn't mean it carries the same loaded meaning, but it's just odd that that connection is there. Right, but it says you have ijma and qiyas, and then of course you've also got, it says none of these things flourished until 3 centuries after Muhammad. All of this stuff, all of this detail comes 3 centuries later. He goes here to Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Abu Dawood. So he's speaking of the hadiths. All of this stuff comes centuries later, right? But then this is what's interesting here. He speaks of Muslims believe that 104 books were given from heaven in the following order. Adam received 10 books. Seth was given 50 books. Enoch was given 30 books, and Abraham was given 10 books. All of these are lost, conveniently. Moses was given the Torah, David, the Zabur, or the Psalms, Jesus, the Injil. These are highly spoken of in the Quran, but are now corrupt and have been abrogated by the Quran. But of course, they don't have a copy of the uncorrupted versions or the Injil to give you. Your thoughts, guys?
Oh.
Do we have a source for the claim about the 104 books? Because it's one thing to say this, but who says that? Is that just some?
This is in Samuel Zwemer's book. He spent decades working as a missionary in that region. So this is long before. Now, from Usama, he was saying that he has seen how the narrative has changed as they deal with new polemics. They come up with new arguments. They develop new arguments and counters and such. But if you start to examine within the Islamic sources, more what are now fairly obscure, what they hide, you start to find references to Enoch and references to things that they probably don't want to talk about today.
Yeah, there's some connections between the Quran and the Book of Enoch, but I'm thinking who said that Adam was given 10 books and Seth 50 books? Zwemer can't have. Yeah, he wrote it down, but he must have got this from somewhere, mustn't he?
Yeah, he would have got it from some Islamic source. I mean, so he's just writing a book on what he's learned about this.
What I could say
he puts some importance there because he puts it up at the top, as though in his view, this is very important. I have to be honest. I say I've never heard of that before, so I wonder really whether it's a mainstream belief of Islam or if it's just some random.
Or they've just scrubbed it and or they've just swept it under the carpet because it's inconvenient.
People are very careless with their books to lose 90 books like that.
Yeah, Lloyd, Paul, everyone. That I think the thing with this story about those 104 books, it's a very late, I think so, a very late attempt at a sort of rationalization of what the Quran says. The Quran talks about the Injil, it talks about the Zabur, talks about the Torah, of course. It talks about Abraham's folios, and so and also it talks about the Quran. So in the mind of a traditionist, trying to make sense out of this, and trying to make a bigger sense with what Islam should be. Islam should be the religion given to Adam. So Adam must have been given a book. It talks about Seth, it talks about Enoch, it talks about also other prophets. So they must have been given books. So in order to make sense out of this, they invent this idea of books having been given to these people, but there's nothing there's no source. There's nothing to vouch for these counts of books, and it doesn't make sense.
No, granted,
but Adam have books. In what language, for example?
Who's he given the books for?
Yes, I had never actually heard this one either. I just knew the basic ones. But as you were talking, I went to Grok. I asked, was Adam given books? And I've been given a link. I've put it here on the private chat just in case that you want to click on it and we can look at it. But the answer from Grok was yes. Adam was given 10, Seth was given 50, Enoch was given 30, and Abram was given 10. That was the immediate answer from Grok. So I'm just as surprised as you are.
Yep. So the idea being that according to the Islamic traditions of the day, these are the stories they told themselves. I think a lot of these have disappeared. Let me show you a simple example, right? Let me just bring this up. I mean, this I covered yesterday. I had Usama on with me, okay? This is the 300 authenticated miracles of Muhammad, compiled by Badr Azimabadi, right? So these are the authentic miracles of Muhammad. I'll just go here to this. During the Battle of the Trenches, while digging a trench, a hard rock caused great difficulty. It could not be broken by the pick, right, by a pick. So when the Holy Prophet, peace be upon him, was informed, he dropped into the trench and gave such a blow with the pick that 1/3 of the rock was hewed asunder. And he said, "Glory be to Allah, the keys of Syria have been given to me." With the second blow of the pick, the apostle hewed another 1/3 of the rock. In the third attempt, the remaining portion of the rock was broken to pieces. While digging a trench, whenever any parts, okay, so there was a hard rock that could not be broken, the Prophet would call for water and he would put a little of his saliva in it. Then he prayed as Allah willed him to pray. And then he sprinkled the water on the rock, which pulverized like a heap of sand. There are hundreds of these. Yeah, I can bring up other sources from genuine Islamic scholars talking about how many of these narrations are false, but these are stories they've spread. I think now they're just trying to forget these things because they're embarrassing. These are stories.
I want to buy a copy of this book. It sounds. Can you get it on Amazon?
I'll send you a PDF.
No, I like to read. You know, a good book. I want to have on my bookcase. It is.
Yeah,
it sounds like it's quality. Stories. It sounds like it's quality. This one.
Definitely. We just digest book club of the month, right? Yeah, JC. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes, clicked actually on that link, and this is actually what it gave me. The website is islamqa.info. And this is the narration here, 104 books, 50 pages were sent down to Seth, and so on and so forth. So narrated by Ibn Hibban in An-Sahih. I don't know if that's right, but hey, there it is.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? So the stories that Muslims tell and how they catch themselves, right? So it's not like I was making it up, you know. I'm just reporting it, so don't kill the messenger. So
no, yeah. I'm very glad you reported it. Look, you can buy it on Amazon for £4.08. So that's hard. That's not going to break the bank.
Yeah, well, that's great. So yeah, so there you go. So this is a story, but this is interesting. As we go forward, as the pieces get tied, as the little, as we tie the little pieces together, you start to see how this is relevant, where this idea comes from, right? At the moment, I'm still building my case till I get to the book of ELCHASAI. But we have all these books that they don't have, but they'll claim to know what the contents supposedly were, oddly enough. Okay, so we've got that. Then he says analysis of the borrowed elements of Islam. Okay, and this goes back again. Now he's drawing on older traditions, older knowledge as well. You can go back into the German scholars from the 1800s. You can go back even prior to that. German and English scholars from 200, 300 years ago were talking about this. And he says from heathenism as existed in Mecca or prevalent in other parts of Arabia, right? So from paganism, Islam was drawing traditions from paganism. From Judaism, the Old Testament, but more especially the Talmud, as the source of Jewish ideas prevalent in Arabia before Muhammad. And from Christianity, corrupt form is found in the apocryphal Gospels, like the Gospel of Barnabas. So this stuff is well known, and this is not the only guy to mention this. It's just convenient in his book. He speaks of Sabaeanism, astrological superstitions, that meteorites are cast at the devil, oaths by the planets and the stars, circumambulation of the Kaaba, and also perhaps the lunar calendar, and Allah as name of supreme deity used in old poems and worshipped by Mecca, right? Arabian idolatry, Mecca, right? Pilgrimage in every detail. Now, the Sabaeans, much of the practices, in a different episode, but I have covered it here as well, something like 90% of the practices of modern Muslims were things that the Sabaeans practiced, but they were moon-worshipping occultic pagans. But Muslims have almost identical practices today, right? Polygamy, slavery, easy divorce and social law, ceremonial cleanliness, forbidden food, circumcision, cosmogony. They are different stores of the earth and the bridge over hell. So you have Zoroastrianism for the bridge over hell as one example. Paradise, its character, the Huris. These are the Parikas of Avesta, right? Then you've got the doctrine of the jinn and the various kinds and the exorcism of jinn taken from Zoroastrianism. So you've got Arabian idolatry, Sabaeanism, which is somewhat Gnostic. Buddhism, words that represent Jewish ideas and are not Arabic but Hebrew, Tabut, the Ark, the Torah, the Law, Eden, and so on. He speaks of Jahannam, right? The rabbi, and so on. He mentions a whole bunch of things. Furqan. Oh, hey, Emmanuel, how are you doing?
When was this written? Hi.
That's a good question. Let me find it.
Hi, Emmanuel.
Let me just find when he wrote his book. Princeton. Yeah, that's a good question. When exactly did he scribble this? This one is 1900.
1900, yeah. Okay. Lots of things have been discussed since then, of course. But it's really amazing that 126 years ago he was able to gather all of this.
Yeah, but if you go to Tisdall's book, he first started publishing on that in 1890. Right, he updated it as he published like 3 or 4 versions of it, so he kept updating it. But he obviously got it prior to the 1890s, so you can go back 140 years and people were talking about this. The same material, the same ideas, And these were missionaries who traveled to Arabia, who went to Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Yemen, and they were saying, "Hold on, we've learned all these crazy things."
No, it's very interesting. Of course. Not everything here is to be taken for granted.
We'll talk more as we go, but we want to look at the continuity of ideas through centuries. You can see it. Hold on, it's in Islam today. You go back 100 years, you go back 200 years, you go back 300, 400, 500, 600 years, and the same idea is in these groups that are all coming from the same source. And you're like, the idea is persistent, right? And we're going to go back and we're going to find, where does this begin? Where do we first have a written record of this?
Hi guys, is my audio okay? Is the volume good?
Sounds good.
So I just want to say the only way I see, that Buddhist influences gotten mixed up in this is actually through Manichaeism. Otherwise, I don't see how they would have even direct contact with Buddhism. So I think a lot of this actually comes from Manichaeism, because Manichaeism has a lot of Buddhist influences.
Yes, we'll talk more about that as we go. So I'm just putting out these things. Look, it's a big surprise to you guys, right? But there's a lot of non-mainstream ideas that, look, we've been fixated. I think Muslims have trained us, they've indoctrinated us, they've conditioned us to talk about the Hadith and the Quran. See, first it was about the Quran, then they had to default to the Quran and Hadith. Then they had to default to the Quran, Hadith, and Tafsirs. And now it's and now finally they managed to fall back, but it's going to Quran, Hadith, Tafsirs, and the Sirah, right? And now suddenly the Sharia, people are starting to openly talk about the Sharia, right? I will mention, I know a guy who started talking about the Sharia many years ago, and everyone thought he was crazy, right? But now suddenly that word is everywhere, right? And now but scholars knew about this, missionaries especially knew about this centuries ago. And they're only becoming openly discussed now. Scholarship's only willing to look at some of these things now. He speaks of here, for instance, he mentions the Virgin, his sinlessness, and the apostles, and he speaks of Hawari, an Abyssinian word, right? And so he speaks of okay, so where are these words coming from? Where the influences, right? Doesn't mean he had all the answers, but he was saying what he was hearing. He was reporting what he was learning. Right? Wrong ideas of the Trinity as held by Arabian heretical sects, Christian legends like the Seven Sleepers, Alexander of the Horns, right? And Luqman, he says Luqman is taking ideas from Aesop's fables, right? And so on and so on and so on. You understand? He doesn't have all the answers, but he's saying, look, man, there's a lot of weird things here that we don't have an easy explanation for, but this is what's there. And it's a mishmash. Because he says it's Yep, go on, JC.
Right there where you are. It's actually saying Seven Sleepers. We know that one, Alexander of the Horns, and he's saying Luqman is also a Christian legend. I'm actually not aware of that one.
I don't think it's a Christian legend, but Luqman is Aesop's fables. So there's stuff taken from Aesop's fables that they learned, right? So it's just that there's lots of interesting things here. Pharaoh, the calf, Moses, fables related to him are all Jewish tales. So they knew these were all narratives stolen from other sources. Any thoughts, guys, before I move on to the next page, to the next topic?
I have a thing on Ramadan. There was a study I did a few years ago. When you look at the word Ramadan in the Wettstein 1913 manuscript, so a very old Quranic collection, you see that the word has been written and rewritten, and it's very, very odd. And if you try to look at the different layers of ink, but one will have to do it with special equipment, of course. I just did it with what I had.
Right.
You can understand that there was an original word which was Ramad, not Ramadan.
Mm-hmm.
And Ramad, it's not with the same letters. Ramad means ashes.
Lent. Well, then he says here Lent. Ramadan to imitate Lent.
A fasting period. Yeah, exactly. A fasting period that is referred to with ashes. It's the Christian Lent.
Tradition of Lent. But he says it here, Ramadan to imitate Lent.
Yeah. But it just put it as an intuition. Yeah, it must be an imitation of Christianity. Yeah. But when you look at the manuscript and you see evidence for the changing of the word from ashes to Ramadan, is that something else?
Catherine, yes, the Seven Sleepers story is from Christian origin. That is a Christian story or legend. Yeah, but think about it. These were dismissed, but now we're rediscovering a lot of old material. I mean, you said you're doing a book on the origin of the Islamic myths and narratives. Well, I mean, again, you can go to Tisdall's book, and he goes through dozens of them.
And another point, Lloyd. I have a friend here in France who is the webmaster and the how do you say that, the artisan of a website, a new website called Al-Kalam, al-kalam.fr. It's in French. I can show it to you. Let me just share my screen.
Une révolution?
Yeah, that's a website. It's in French, but you can have it translated very, very easy. And there is a whole chapter on the sources of the Quran. And he has put together a huge amount of scholarship.
Oh,
everything is sources and references for everything. For example, for the story of Harut and Marut, but there are many other stories like this, and I think it will be the basis for a book to be published on the many sources of the Quran.
That's incredible. Yeah, Islam is falling apart in real time, man.
Yeah, exactly. But you see how the networking we are doing here, and the networking that everyone can do thanks to internet has completely changed the game. Now we have access to books from 1900, for example, and we can connect the dots. And we don't have to rely solely on scholars, academic scholars. We can count on the minds of tens of thousands of people that are working together to understand the problems and find solutions.
Don't forget, these were missionaries who spoke Persian, who spoke Arabic, who lived there for sometimes decades. They traveled, they spoke to people. So they were doing polemics, they were doing apologetics. These people were traveling through that region. So you're getting it from first-hand witnesses. That's a very high quality of witness in this case.
Yeah, and the Muslims that were encountering at the time, they didn't know about apologetics and so on. They had a sort of raw Islam, unfiltered Islam.
Right, agreed. Yeah, he writes about that, how you would have these discussions. He talks about that in his book. It's actually quite interesting, but it's just that what he puts here together, I mean, we've forgotten a lot of this, and now we're rediscovering it. Yeah,
I'll just make one observation. It's also very fascinating. But the Quran doesn't necessarily it doesn't necessarily present itself, or it isn't composed as though it's trying to steal other people's stories. And that's I think a common misconception amongst revisionist scholars.
Trying to correct them. It's trying to correct the record, essentially.
Possibly, but I think that the Quran assumes that its audience is aware of these sources. So it's not as though it's just borrowing or passing stuff off as its own, that it wasn't there. To give a couple of examples, we were talking about the sleepers in the cave, and it mentions the coin that they have. It's a completely the fact that one of them had money is completely irrelevant in the Quran. It's a completely out of place statement. But the only reason it is there is because the audience knew what the significance of the coins were. I mean, if anyone out there doesn't know, it's in the Jacob of Saru version of the Seven Sleepers of Ephesus. One of them, they wake up, they're a bit peckish, and one of them goes into town to buy food, and they realize when he tries to spend the money that's in his pocket that it's whatever it is, sort of 200, 500 years out of date. It's got the picture of the Roman emperor, the Domitian, who was it, who was persecuting them, and he tries to pass it off, and they realize that the Roman Empire has now become Christian Byzantium, and the battle has been won. And so the emperor's face on the coin is a symbol of how humanity's works will pass away, and faith in God will become justified over time. It's an allegory for the last day and the resurrection. And I think the Quran mentions that one of the sleepers has money because it wants its audience to know this. Similarly, you were mentioning about Ramadan, and in the verse of the Quran that talks about this, I think it's Surah Al-Baqarah. Is it 183? I had it a moment ago. Yes, Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 183. It says, "O you who believe, fasting is prescribed for you as it was prescribed for those before you." So I think it's not. There's an acknowledgement there that there was a Lent, that there was a Day of Atonement, that this wasn't entirely new.
Tisdall speaks of that, the Jewish feast and festival of atonement, the ritual of atonement was borrowed into Islam, and he speaks of, so Tisdall speaks of it as well. Back in the 1890s, he was talking about it, as a borrowing, as an acknowledgement of Jewish practice. It's not just stories.
I guess my point is, when we look at these sources, which is fascinating, as one of the most fruitful areas of Quran studies is to find out where they came from, and then ask yourself how it ended up being used. When we do this, we're uncovering the true intended meaning of the Quran. We're not trying to show Muhammad as a fraud and a charlatan. I'm not. I'm trying to find out what the actual intended meaning of the Quran was. And I see little evidence here that the author is trying to hide any of his source material. He is using it in his own way, and I want to find out what he was doing there.
Right, Emmanuel, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I'm assuming we, at least everyone who's here, is presumably in agreement that when Islam started out, it was not yet Islam, if that makes any sense. Muslims always tell me, "Oh, you Christians, you didn't know that you were Christians. You didn't have a religion like right away. But we Muslims, we right away, we had our book, we had our religion, we had everything. Everything was ready made. But it wasn't like that. It was a process, and it wasn't just like with other religions. Originally, it was not not yet seen as an independent religion of its own, and we're seeing a lot of the influences where it came from.
Who was in charge of the change, where it was changed, what it was called changed. So we can see this. It wasn't settled. Yeah.
Yes, and a huge influence, as we also all agree, is of course the various. It's not just one. In my humble opinion, it's mainly the Manichaeans, but of course, it's not just the Manichaeans. It comes from a lot of. There were a lot of sects and a lot of heretical Gnostic Christian sects akin to the Manichaeans. So it's not just the Manichaeans, it's similar sects as well. And they all had a huge influence on what later became Islam. That's why you have the emphasis on fasting. That was very important for these Christian Gnostic sects as well. I think especially in Manichaeism as well, that was very important. And also the washing you do before you perform the prayers, that was also very important. That's why they were originally called in Arabic or whatever it was, those who wash themselves, and then you have all these influences from Christianity that are not based on the Bible, but on Gnostic texts and on just plain legends.
Yeah, that's a mishmash. Yeah.
And may I add something? Yes, weaving a couple of things together. So on the video that we had discussed before from Al-Jalad, one of the things that he said is that there were these gods from Arabia that they get merged into the story of Noah. So they take the Abrahamic faith in that region and they make their own influences into them. And when we read the narrative, not so much the Quran maybe, but certainly the narrative, the Standard Islamic Narrative, we see that that's what they do. They keep talking about the Abrahamic faith, and everybody was a Muslim. And when Abraham goes to Egypt, he says, "We're the only two Muslims here." They make everything. They just rewrite all of these stories to make it about themselves, and we see that, which Al-Jalad has confirmed very clearly in the narrative. So why would they do that only about a number of pagan goddesses? They did it with everything that was around. If they had a tradition, they tried to convert that tradition into now
That's what
Abrahamic.
Gnostics do. That's a Gnostic practice.
Exactly. That I was going to say that comes from Manichaeism as well. That was very important in Manichaeism, and that's how they were able to spread as far as they did, is because they never presented, never ever, no matter what religion they encountered, they never presented themselves as a separate religion. They, when they were encountering Christians, they were like, "Oh yes, we're Christians too," right? And oh yeah, we believe in Jesus. Jesus was one of our most important prophets. But did you know there was a prophet after Jesus? There was a final prophet. There is the seal of the prophet, our prophet Mani. He's just like Jesus, but he's even better. And we have even more knowledge than you Christians. I mean, we're Christians too, of course. And when they encountered Buddhists, again, they would even dress themselves as Buddhist monks. Whatever religion they encountered, they would, have the attire of their clergy, of their monks, and always present themselves as being part of that religion. That's why, finally in Islam, you have all these influences from all kinds of religions, and you're wondering, why are there so many influences from all these religions? That's because of the influence of Manichaeism, because in every region, they pass themselves off as a different religion.
Right. Actually, let me do two things. One, I want to show something here. This is T.W. Arnold. I had a quote from him last week. He says, "Islam was born in the desert with Arab Sabaeanism for its mother, Judaism for its father, and its foster nurse was Eastern Christianity." That's T.W. Arnold. He was also a missionary, I believe, in that region. And then Zvema, we've just quoted him now. We've just shown his book. "Islam is not an invention, but a concoction. There is nothing novel about it except the genius of Muhammad in mixing old ingredients in a new medicine for human ills and forcing it down by means of the sword." Okay. Now, I want to show something else. So this is what Gnostics do. If you take "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, how I wonder what you are, up above the world so high, like a diamond in the sky," right? So Gnostics will take any narrative, and they'll go, "Twinkle, twinkle, little star" is an allegorical representation of the journey of the soul in search of enlightenment and liberation from the material world. It looks for enlightenment from above. The star is the divine spark within every individual, symbolizing the divine. That's exactly what they do. Let me give you another example. Okay, let me find here. So it's called the allegorical hermeneutic. So Gnosticism, I should call it, depends on allegorical hermeneutic, right? So for instance, let's take Mary had a little lamb and how they use existing narratives and twist it. Okay, so they take a myth, right? Mary had a little lamb. That's an English language nursery rhyme, 19th century American origin, first published by American Sarah Josepha Hale in 1830. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow. And everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go. He followed her to school one day. That was against the rule. It made the children laugh and play to see a lamb at school. Now the Gnostic comes along, and Gnostics reinterpret. They have a fantastic method of interpretation. Okay? See, the true Gnostic is above the rules and laws of the material world. So you think that this, you know what? You imagine that this famous poem is about a little girl whose pet lamb followed her to school, but you're wrong. You see, if you were inducted into the mysteries, you would see that Mary is a teacher of the Gnosis. Her lamb is her student. And the fleece is the garment of bad thinking that was washed clean white because the student came to understand the deep truth, the Gnostic mysteries. And the student became so attracted to Gnostic teachings that he dared to enter the school, the temple of learning for the initiate, to become one of the elite of the Gnostics. And even though it was against the rules, you see, do you really want true knowledge? Well, then you have to go against the norm. You see, you have to break the rules here. And it's against the rules, it's against the norms. But those inducted into our nonsense realize that the true Gnostic is above the laws of the material world. You see, this is how they take the story, they adapt it. And Muslims do the same. They reinterpret reality, and the contradictions are all inverted. It's called Gnostic allegorical method. And then they build
I had to mute myself because you had me laughing a lot. Can I say something?
Go ahead, please. Yeah.
Yeah. See, that's how they are always able to pass themselves off as whatever religion you already believe in. That's why it's so attractive to people, because they never come across as outsiders. They always come across as fellow believers, of whatever you believe, and then you let your guard down, and that's why that you illustrated that quite well. The approach they're using, right, through that weird Gnostic lens where words don't mean what they mean on the surface, and I see the same with Muslims. When you probably have the same feeling. When you argue with Muslims about what the Quran says, and you look up what it says in Arabic, and you say, oh yeah, this word means this, and this word, yeah, it definitely means this, and you show them the translation, and yes,
Yeah.
look, this is accurate translation. But they're always, no, that's not what it means. No.
Mhm.
When the Quran says this, it actually means that. It doesn't mean what it says on the surface.
As Scrunchie says, it's allegorical.
Yeah.
That's good.
See, you
very good.
have to interpret it in a certain way, and we have all these texts that interpret it in a certain way, just like Gnostics would. They would. So Gnostics is the same. They tell you, oh yeah, we believe in the Bible or whatever book you believe in, but then they have all these texts that interpret the Bible in a completely different way than what it says on the surface.
Yeah, everyone, welcome to the online Leering Center. We did so fantastic. Yeah. So you see that they simply take an idea, create some doubt, and they create a whole fanciful description, and boom, there you go. And they master.
And they got that's true. It's very clever the way you presented it, Lloyd. It's worth bearing in mind that this comes after the Quran. So, for example, the Umayyads, they knew that it was all about Jerusalem, and we know they knew because they built all these monuments up on the Temple Mount. They built the Dome of the Rock, the Dome of the Chain, various other things up there. And if you were around in the 690s, there would have been no doubt whatsoever where the Umayyads thought the center of the world was. It would have been on Temple Mount, on the foundation stone of the temple.
Once they slam.
Afterwards, I would say the Abbasid revolution and the power shifts over to Baghdad, and that is when the nonsense really becomes acceptable, and so we're not. For me, I'm interested in knowing what the Quran says, but all this nonsense comes later. It's
once they run into the hard edge of reality, in a way where history undermines them, then they've got to do all of this fancy storytelling.
That's when you get the night journey up to the heavens and this and that.
Reality is the thing you run into when your belief is wrong.
Yep. Yeah. JC, you were going to say?
No, I was not going to say anything. But I was actually thinking the chat seems to actually be having a good time today. This is actually proving to be a very, very fun show. It should have been called comedy as well.
Well, yeah, it's just that, look, I mean, I'm obviously somewhat out on a limb here. I actually wrote this about 5 years ago. Okay, this set of slides is not new. I wrote these slides 5, maybe 6 years ago. I presented them once on a very small channel, a different channel that's no longer even active, because I wasn't sure enough about it to actually do it on my channel. Right, so I presented it, and now but the more that I've come to learn, the more I realize, but yeah, this is spot on. There's some value here. Okay, let's just continue. So Muhammad, the counterfeit Jesus. So Muhammad here in this image of Muhammad, which is not haram, drawing Momo here, looking like a Chinaman, which is very weird. Okay, Momo the Chinaman. But notice though, this could also be something like Azerbaijan or something of that type. Right, this doesn't necessarily have to be Chinese, but notice these are all very Asian. This could be Mongolian. It looks kind of, but it's that East Asian, but genuinely, I don't mean East Asian as in Pakistani, okay?
No, it was the style of the times.
Yeah, but that's what I want to say is not only does he look Asian in this painting, but the style of the painting itself is well, very much Chinese, actually. This is Chinese painting style.
It's medieval Persian in theory, but yeah, no, exactly. So here Muhammad leads Abraham, Moses, and Jesus in prayer, and Muhammad's halo covers his entire body. The rest only have halos around their heads because he's special.
Yes, and I mentioned it before. This also comes from Buddhism. So there is a lot of Chinese influence in this painting, and even in the way the painting is painted, but also in a depiction of Muhammad. This is normally how in Buddhism bodhisattvas would be depicted, what you call the halo.
That is another interesting point, the Buddhist angle. And we're getting there slowly, because I know this is like the 3rd episode we've done. I haven't yet got to the book of ELCHASAI, but which is the whole focus of this thing. But I'm trying to put down all of the pieces that lead us there. You know, to say, look, this is where we are today, more or less. Here's where we were a century or two ago. How did we get here? Where did the stuff come from? What's the source? But yeah, that's a very good point. The whole Buddhist angle, so the stories in the Quran are taken from earlier uninspired works. We know that. Heretical, pseudo-biblical, and Gnostic texts were included and altered, okay? Apocrypha, Midrashim, Targums, Gnostic myths. Okay? That Islam is a concoction, is a conclusion that dates from the 8th century, reaffirmed by 19th century scholarship. We can go back to the 1800s to find evidence of that. Right? So, St. John of Damascus. He's born in Damascus in 680. Now, there's a big effort afoot right now to, shall we say, dismiss his work, to say, no, he was wrong, because clearly he goes against the standard narrative, but he was an eyewitness. And what if what he wrote was an accurate depiction and the story we tell today is totally different? So was he inventing fabrications, or was he telling the truth and the story we tell today is the fabrication? That's because people are trying to dismiss his statements, right? So there's also the superstition of the Ishmaelites, which to this day prevails and keeps people in error. It is a forerunner of the Antichrist. They're descended from Ishmael, who was born to Abraham of Hagar. And for this reason, they are called both Hagarenes and Ishmaelites. They're also called Saracens, which is derived from the Saras Kenoi, or the destitute of Sarah, because of what Hagar said to the angel, Sarah hath sent me away destitute. They used to be idolaters, and they worshipped the morning star and Aphrodite, whom in their own language they called Khaybar. Now, I've been to Khubr. My friend from Jordan used to call it Khubr. I've been there a few times, which is west of Mecca, okay, which means great. And so down to the time of Heraclius, there were very great idolaters. From that time to the present, the false prophet named Muhammad has appeared in their midst. This man, after having chanced upon the Old and New Testament, and likewise, it seems, having conversed with an Arian monk, devised his own heresy. Then, having insinuated himself into the good graces of the people by a show of seeming piety, he gave out that a certain book had been sent down to him from heaven. That's an important point. He's not the first one to receive a book given. Adam got a book, Seth got a book, Enoch got a book, David got a book, Jamie got a book, Odin got a book, I got a book, you got a book, everybody gets a book. You see, he wanted to go with the idea that I got sent a book by an angel, right? Why would that idea be important to the Muhammad myth or the Muhammad narrative? Why that idea? And for that, we have to go back to the end of the first, beginning of the second century, to the book of ELCHASAI. That's where we first find that mythology become concrete. And he had sent down some ridiculous compositions in this book of his, and he gave it to them as an object of veneration. Any thoughts before I go on?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hold on.
When you look at the sort of depiction of Muhammad as being the prophet of Islam, there is a high probability that this writing hasn't been written in John of Damascus' time.
Yeah.
But it must have been written way after him. So it's a pseudo John of Damascus. And the thing here, for example, there is this thing with this Aryan monk. Actually, this idea of Muhammad being taught by a Christian monk comes from Christian apologetics that wanted to counter an Islam that was already formed. And they wrote about this monk being named Sergius.
It's in the Sirah as well. They call him they call him several names. They have more than one name for the guy, but they speak of an Nestorian monk.
You see, for this to make sense, you need the prophet to have been invented, the idea of a prophecy. The idea is that Islam comes from one man and one revelation. And it took time for such an idea to emerge. I don't think it emerged before the Abbasids. Maybe a little bit before the Abbasids, but mostly it has been developed by the Abbasids. And the reason for this is that the Umayyads, they did not need the prophet to exist in order for their power to be divine. They were already the strongest. They were the successors of Abdul Malik. So God had already chosen them. And God showed the world that he had chosen them by making them the strongest of all.
Right. Okay, yeah, let's continue. So, we're getting very slowly.
Were you finishing on John of Damascus, sir?
No. I just wanted to mention what he said. I mean, these all it's like I'm putting down puzzle pieces on the table. We'll try and connect the dots as we go. So I'm just putting down all the pieces.
Because I was going to make a comment on John,
Go ahead.
of Damascus if I could. It's not. I don't think it's on the section that you've quoted there. But he goes on to talk about the books of Muhammad. He cites 4 separate books. He doesn't mention the Quran. He doesn't say
You're right.
he wrote a book called the Quran. It doesn't seem on the face of it to be aware that there's a single scripture called the Quran. He talks about the cow and the women and the table, and then he finds a 4th book, which is called the Camel of God.
Yes.
Now this, to me, this makes it sound more likely that he's early rather than late, because if you wanted to undermine Islam as it later is, wouldn't you criticize the Quran? Wouldn't you make a point of challenging the ideas or ridiculing the ideas that are in the Quran? Why would you pretend not to know that the Quran existed, but to create another book that's not even part of the Quran? It seems that's if you want to try and ridicule or undermine Islam, that's a strange way of going about it. But there is other evidence which suggests that the Quran, the surahs of the Quran, used to circulate individually, which makes it more likely, I think, that it was quite an early source rather than a later source.
And there's more than one set of research that has converged on the idea that the Quran took a couple of 100 years to write, and it's multiple authors and was compiled fairly late. So that's a fairly strong thing. Yeah.
Before we actually move on from John of Damascus, that there is obscure references of one of the surahs, one of the last ones actually, being called the camel, like quite early on. And there are the sources, so I could find them if you haven't come across them. They're very, very obscure, but an argument can be made that a surah was called camel. And with John of Damascus, the thing is that if we take it as it's been given, it makes Islam very awkward, and it basically disproves the standard Islamic narrative. But if it is written later, it makes Islam actually, yes, worse, because it means it was created even later. That's why I like the source of John of Damascus, because if you take it as it is, it's already very damaging. And if it is then proven that it is later, it just makes things even worse.
Yeah, no. Okay, so let's have a mention of the Targums, just briefly. Targum means translation in Hebrew. The Targums were the Aramaic translations of the Hebrew scriptures, often a loose paraphrase with additional commentary. They often include a variety of mythical stories and legendary midrashic material mixed in with biblical stories. Right? In ancient Jewish communities, there was a practice called midrash, where they produced literary interpretations. Let's call it tafsir of sacred texts. These interpretations often had stories that expanded the biblical narratives and added new details, sometimes even creating whole new legendary stories. The midrashic tales were often included in interpretive translations known as the Targums. These were copies of the Old Testament texts, typically in Aramaic, that didn't just translate, but also try to explain a tafsir to make the text come alive for everyday people who may not have been as scholarly or learned. For example, in Deuteroscopy 6, verses 4-5, the text reads, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might." The Jerusalem Targums expanded this into, "When the end had come to our father Jacob, that he should be taken up from the world, he called the 12 tribes, his sons, and gathered them round his couch. Then Jacob, our father, rose up and said to them, Do you worship any idol that Terah, the father of Abraham, worshipped? Do you worship any idol that Laban, the brother of his mother, worshipped? Or worship you the God of Jacob?" The 12 tribes answered together with fullness of heart and said, "Hear now, Israel our father. The Lord our God is one Lord." Jacob responded and said, "May his great name be blessed forever. And you shall love the instruction of the law and of the Lord with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your wealth." I'd say that's a little bit of an embellishment myself, which tells us a little bit about the Quran and the tafsirs and the sirahs and the hadiths.
It tells a lot about the kind of mind, Semitic mind of this time. The Jews used to do this with their scriptures, and so did the Arabs.
And they borrowed it from the Jews. They stole that idea from the Jews, because we mentioned that they stole ideas from the Targums, legends from the Targums.
Yeah.
And the Targums are expansions.
It's not like they stole. You do not steal an idea. You are influenced by an idea.
Sure, fair enough.
It's evidence of a sort of cohabitation between Arabs and Jews.
No, fair enough. There's evidence of influence. It's influences, granted. So the original sources of the Quran is a book that I had. This is a reprint of the 1905 edition. He's a British Anglican priest. He was a linguist, historian, and philologist, which is historical linguistics and etymology, secretary of the Church of England Missionary Society in Isfahan, Persia. He was fluent in Middle Eastern languages, including Persian, Gujarati, Urdu, Punjabi, and Arabic. And he says here, Muhammad adapted his pretended revelations to what he believed to be the need of the moment. The same thing is true with regard to what we read in Surah Al-Ahzab regarding the circumstances attending his marriage with Zainab, whom his adopted son Zayd divorced for his sake. A reference to what the Quran itself, Surah 33, verse 37, says about the matter, coupled with the explanations afforded by the commentators and the traditions, will prove that Muhammad's own character and disposition have left their mark upon the moral law of Islam and upon the Quran itself. That's the London Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge from 1911. Okay, he writes, and he says, "We must therefore not forget that Muhammad was never brought into contact with pure gospel Christianity. It is largely to the false forms which the faith had then almost universally assumed that the rise of Islam is really from these prevented Muhammad from ever really seeking to discover the truth in the gospel. and thus impelled him to found a new anti-Christian religion. That's the influence of Christianity and Christian apocryphal books on Islam. And then he says there is no satisfactory.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure I completely agree with Mr. Tisdall on that. On the business about Zayd and Zainab, it's the story as it is told is, to my mind, quite clearly a variation on David and Bathsheba. I think the coincidences are remarkable. Particularly, well, you got the whole of the story, not one element. I mean, the whole thing is very clear. You got Zayd then going off and dying in battle in a place called Death, and the whole thing sounds very contrived, and it's an attempt to explain the act. So I don't think you can talk about Muhammad's moral character because the story simply isn't true. You can talk about, as for example, David Woods would.
Remember,
he's talk about the Muhammad that Muslims believe in. You can talk about that fictitious Muhammad's moral character.
Look, remember, he's not at this. We're not at the stage in history where people are going, Muhammad never existed. We're not at that point in history, so we've got to see it from his perspective as well. But he's saying this character, clearly there's a moral flaw here. There's a moral failing.
Yeah. But you all know about.
I don't think that Muhammad didn't exist. I totally agree that Muhammad existed, but I'm saying that the stories the fill, the Hadith, and the Sirah, not one of them is to be trusted, and you can't. So I think Tisdall was incorrect when he says, "Oh, this shows that Muhammad was a terrible person," because he's basing that upon a story that we can now.
Yeah, but if Muhammad, if you shag, look, according to the Islamic tradition, this man shagged his son's wife. I'd say that's pretty bad, fictional or not. It's a bad example,
Yes, according to the tradition.
Yep.
According to the tradition, yeah. You know about the other David Powers. He wrote a book, Muhammad is not the father of any of your men, and many articles.
Yeah.
He's a fully fledged scholar, and he explained that all this story about Muhammad marrying his daughter-in-law, it doesn't have anything to do with the historical Muhammad, but it has all to do with the legitimacy quarrels within Arab factions way after Muhammad. Some were like the Alids. They had a claim to power because they claimed to be descendants of Muhammad, and some had no such claim. And he thinks that the Quran, this proposition, this story about Muhammad was introduced in the Quran in order to for those who, in order to legitimize those who were writing the Quran, legitimize their claim to power.
No, look,
it goes even a little bit more radical even than that.
Yeah.
It's
much more.
He takes about the 6 verses that begin Muhammad was not the father.
It's a little bit off the
David.
topic. It's not really this particular discussion is not really relevant to where I'm going with this.
Another time we'll go into that.
Yeah. So Tisdall says there is no satisfactory proof that an Arabic version of the New Testament existed in Muhammad's time. In the Orthodox Church, the gospel was neglected in favor. He doesn't mean the Orthodox Church from the Byzantine geography. It's just in standard Christianity, was neglected in favor of the legends of saints, which appealed to the popular taste for the marvelous. Arabia was a refuge for heretics of different sects expelled from the Roman Empire. I've discussed this in previous episodes. It's worth getting back to. I've got a lot of material on that that's well worth, because they kicked out a lot of the heretics from Rome, from Italy, and they ended up in especially concentrated in a handful of places. And Arabia was one of those places. It is clear from the Quran that many of the mythical stories in the apocryphal Gospels and heretical Gnostic works must have reached Muhammad and been accepted as true. Right? So we know these stories from the Quran where it says, this is a lie which he has forged and others have helped him. Tales of the ancient which he has caused to be written. They are dictated before him and he's a mad poet. We know these. I mean, these are well-known verses that speak of him, right? By the way, there's the sources of Islam. Use the one called the sources of the Quran, which is his newer work. This is the older work, right? Now, Muhammad is all ears. We know that from the Sirah. Whoever wants to see Satan, let him take a look at Nabtal bin al-Harith. He was a sturdy black man, right? And it was he who said, Muhammad is all ears. If anyone tells him anything, he believes it, right? We've got that record in the Sirah, right? So, of course, that's the kind of, Among them are those who torment the Prophet and say he's an ear. Say, an ear that is good for you. He has faith in Allah and he trusts the faithful. There's a mercy for those of you who have faith. As for those who torment the apostle of Allah, there's a painful punishment for them. So this seems to be a problem for Islam, right? An ear, say all ear, right? So this seems to be a problem in Quran 961. They don't like this, okay? So I'll end off with this before we get to the ELCHASAI thing, because I was hoping to finish just this section. This is called Heralds of That Good Realm, Syro-Mesopotamian Gnosis and Jewish Traditions by John C. Reeves. This is an interesting paper. I've read it. It's really good. And it's Nag Hammadi and Manichaean Studies from Brill, published in 1996. Published as Jewish Law in Manichaean Cosmogony. Studies in the Book of Giants Traditions, right? Hebrew Union College Press, 1992. So this work goes back even earlier. Through the careful analysis of various pseudepigraphal traditions used and transformed by the Manichaeans, Reeves shows the deep impact of Jewish literary traditions far beyond the boundaries of rabbinic Judaism and of patristic Christianity. Such an approach is not novel. In his Histoire critique de Manichée et de Manichaéisme from Amsterdam, 1734, the Huguenot scholar Isaac de Beausobre, the true founder of Manichaean studies, had already recognized the importance of Jewish apocryphal literature in the immediate background of Manichaeism. Since the discoveries of the Qumran scrolls and of the Nag Hammadi codices, much light has been shed upon the origins of the various Jewish pseudepigraphical traditions, the development and fortleben, how they live on through time among Jews, Christians, Gnostics, sectarians of various shades, Manichaeans, and Muslims. Okay, so we bear this in mind. This is the last. I've got 5 pages on this, and I'll cover that and we'll finish. Enclave cultures. The works from the days of the Second Temple put under the name of Enoch. This is why it's odd that Muslims revere Enoch, because the only other quote-unquote Christian group that revere Enoch or consider him really important are, of course, the Gnostics, the occult Gnostics, but also the Ethiopians, who include the Book of Enoch as part of their scriptural tradition, right? So it's very odd. I mean, they speak of the Hijrah to Ethiopia, and we know that lots of Ethiopian words found their way into Islam as religious words. And those attributed to Adam and Eve in particular, as well as later similar texts, have been much studied and well analyzed. The trajectories followed by these pseudepigraphical traditions are deeply interesting for the historian of religion, since they reflect the multiple transformations of these traditions. They've altered many times, and the dialectics of religious themes, which know not the clear-cut boundaries drawn by rising orthodoxies in the first Christian centuries. So there was a mixing of these ideas, and the stories adapted and changed and changed. It turns out that various heterodoxies or heresies, radical movements that sought to retain enclave cultures, survived and sometimes flourished on the margins of churches growing under broader light, and these were the best carriers for the Jewish traditions. Now, earlier we mentioned, actually, hold on, let me just bring up this. So this is going to be important. This is something worth discussing. I spoke to you about this once. Hold on. Arabia Heresium Ferax, Arabia, the bearer of heresies. Schismatic Christianity's potential influence on Muhammad and the Quran. So this overlaps on this, because when these heresies were kicked out of Rome, they ended up, many of them, to a large degree, ended up in Arabia, especially Najran, and they were very much influential within Arabia. Okay, so now, to a large extent, these processes through which the traditions emerged were cherished and developed in sectarian movements inside and outside of Judaism, but they still remain in the dark. Yet one thing is certain: these traditions reflect a strong interest in myth. Now, if you look at Gnosticism, it's heavily invested in myth, and if you look at the Quran, it is very much retelling myths, right? And poorly retelling biblical stories, but it makes them very mythical. Hence, it is precisely such religious trends which are closest to mythical thought patterns and which we generically call Gnosticism, which will show the greatest interest in these traditions. Now, I've covered before how Islam explicitly claims to be a Gnostic religion. Both Rabbinic Judaism and patristic Christianity will make visible efforts to distance themselves from such mythical thought patterns. In doing so, mainstream Jews and Christians will try their best to ignore or even forget much of their apocryphal literature, which will often owe its survival to underground channels. I'll pause here before I go to the last 2 pages. Any comments from anyone before I go on? Because after this, we get into ELCHASAI, but I just want to finish off on this. Any thoughts? Nope. I'll go on then. So, Reeves' work is a comparative analysis of various pseudepigraphic citations in the Cologne Mani Codex, that extremely important document discovered a generation ago in Egypt, which offers a Manichaean biography of the Prophet of Light. More precisely, these citations come from a part of the text attributed to Bareus, a Manichaean teacher of the second generation. And the heart of the work, chapters 3 to 7, deals with quotations from previously unknown books attributed to Adam and Seth. See, Adam got 10 books, Seth got 40 books. See? So Enoch, Shem, and Enoch, and they have Enosh and Enoch. They reflect Dr. Reeves' vast linguistic knowledge and draw together many texts and traditions from various contexts. Let us note here that Reeves does not use the word syncretism. He prefers symbiosis, a concept which he borrows from the great scholar of the Cairo Geniza, S.D. Goitain. Okay? Now, this strikes me as a mistaken use of the term, because symbiosis refers to people from different religious or ethnic communities sharing much of the same culture. There is no reason to believe that what is obtained in the late antique Near East, except, of course, if one deals with magic, right, has been, okay. He continues, the container, oh, by the way, so Islamic magic is something that very few people speak about, few people touch on, but there's a strong occult aspect in Islam. So this is not, so scholars have tried to call it a symbiosis, but it's not. It's a syncretism. It's a mixing of things that often are not compatible. So therefore, it has to make up fancy stories to try to blend incompatibles. And the catena of citations by Bareus, the teacher, bears witness to the apostolic credibility of Mani. He is seen as the last in a series of prophets and envoys of the good God, since the Urgeschichte and throughout history, since time immemorial, Urgeschichte from the ancient history. Mani is also seen elsewhere in the Manichaean traditions as offering the final and total revelation. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? All of this stuff, which was previously revealed in a somewhat incomplete fashion to mankind through other prophets, right? Like Buddha and Jesus and Zarathustra. And prophecy is a central term here. Mani saw himself as a true prophet, the master of the truth. In this context, it might be worthwhile to reflect upon possible connections between the role and function of the masters of truth in the late antique Near East and the specialists of the word in archaic Greece, such as Pythagoras, right? And various fragments analyzed by Reeves all deal with heavenly raptures of the prophets of the Urzeit. This is the early time, the archaic time, the time before, right? Protozoic time, whatever, to heaven and their adventures. So prophecy was extremely important in the antique Near East. It's against this background one must perceive the birth of Islam. It's odd how these discussions on Manichaeism, on this kind of ancient religious influence, somehow they always come back to mention Islam or Muhammad. The main culture heroes of our period are ELCHASAI, Bardesan, and Marcion, but also Hermes. I've spoken previously about Hermes Trismegistus, who was Thoth, who's also known as Idris, the second or fourth prophet mentioned in the Quran. I think he's the second prophet mentioned in the Quran. So Idris is known as Hermes in Islamic literature, and he's considered, he brought the hikmah, and he's a spiritual ancestor of Muhammad. But he's the he's the Egyptian moon god. And he's known as, he brought Hermeticism, right, which is, occultics are crazy about that stuff, and Gnosticism is partly born out of Hermeticism. And Marcion as well, that's interesting, that's another heresy, that's one of the earliest of the heretics that confronted Christianity. The question of true prophecy as opposed to false prophecy, the concept of major importance among early Jewish Christians, seems to be the capital question for those in search of the nature of truth. And a major historical paradox is in the fact that the Manichaeans were so attracted to these stories, which stemmed ultimately from the biblical tradition, which they despised deeply since it came from Satan. So Muslims borrow biblical traditions, which they despise because it's corrupt. And I'll finish here. As we already know, for instance, through Ibn al-Nadim's Fihrist, and here we can also learn about, in the Fihrist, we actually learn about Sabaean traditions, which are identical to Islamic traditions. And as the CMC makes clear, Mani himself grew up amongst the ELCHASAItes, i.e. in a Jewish Christian baptizing sect. I'll leave it at that. And Hegel coined the expression, the List der Vernunft, which is the ruse or the cunning of reason. I'll leave it at that. I'll pause here for the moment. So that pretty much, I'll skip here. I think we'll end here today. I'll leave this for the next time. But your thoughts so far? I mean, I'm getting to the point, but I'm just putting ideas on the table. Your thoughts?
Can I just jump in for
Please go
a very obvious remark? The main character here is missing. It's like the elephant in the room. It's Jesus. All these people, all these ELCHASAI, Mani, and so on, they all shape themselves in the shape of a Jesus. You see, there are many, I'm sure there are many influences from ancient Gnosticism before Christianity, but the idea of a man bringing salvation and so on, being the master of truth, the master of light, I think it's an imitation of Jesus. So it also tells us how Christianized these people were. The Arabs were Christianized. They were not Orthodox Christians, but they had a devotion for Jesus. And the same with all these groups we're talking about.
It is Christian, but it is Christian Gnosticism, which, well, you know, it depends on what your view is. But if you are a mainstream Christian, then it has nothing to do with actual Christianity. From an outsider's perspective, it would look similar on the surface. That's why they are able to pass themselves off.
And they would present it as similar. They would speak in those words, use the language.
Right, and they would use words like that, and they would tell you, yes, we affirm Jesus. He's one of our most important prophets. He brought us so much knowledge, right? But the concept of, you got to realize, well, actually, usually they would actually not speak of Jesus. They would speak of Christ. And you assume they mean Jesus. But Christ is a title, not a name. And to them, Christ is similar to the New Age concept of Christ consciousness that we are familiar with today. So if you obtain the knowledge, the gnosis, you can be your own Christ. You can be your own savior. You can attain self-salvation through knowledge, through the light of knowledge. But this isn't Jesus bringing you. This is Christ, yes. But ultimately, they believe that Christ is, well, he basically reincarnates. That's why they. That's where that stuff about Adam being a prophet comes from. That also comes from the Manichaeism. From the Manichaeans, because they believed Christ reincarnated. Christ was all these prophets. Christ was Adam. Christ was all these other prophets, and he keeps reincarnating. And then ultimately, Christ becomes the final prophet, the seal of the prophet.
But that's the same as the Muslim belief of Hermes or Hermes Trismegistus. He first incarnates as Hermes, who the Greeks know as Hermes, but of course who the Egyptians know as Thoth. He came back. This was pre-flood. Then he comes back post-flood twice. So he comes back in 3 incarnations. So you've got the same idea, and he's supposed to be literally an ancestor of Muhammad's, and he brings the hikmah, right, the wisdom. But I mean, we know this is a moon god. It's the Egyptian moon god. What the hell? But Muslims have no shame, I guess.
Yeah, you showed it yourself in one of your previous slides, where it said that Muslims worship the morning star, and of course now Muslims would say we don't worship the morning star, but we talked about this already. They have the morning star on their flag, and they have the morning star on the top of their mosques. The morning star is the star in the Star and Crescent.
Yeah. In fact, Osama was telling me a couple of days ago, I was going through the history of the Islamic symbol. It's called the Halal. And he says he's read it in the Bible. He's read it, like he's seen it in the Hebrew, but he's read it in the Arabic. And it's the Halal. And then he said, when I explained the history of the Halal in Islam, it's actually it's an Arabic deity. It's the deity of the crescent moon. It's a god. It's a moon god. And he was like,
right.
Now that makes so much sense, because he didn't know that before. So
this
it's
is
the Halal.
Yeah, I just want to add, because this is really important. Because Odon, I don't want you to be deceived, because this is how they deceive people. You think, oh, they're talking about Christ as the light. Oh, but that's not what they mean. They mean light in the sense of the morning star, the light bringer, Lucifer in Latin. That is their true Christ.
Yeah, of course. I agree with you. But the point I wanted to pinpoint is that all these groups share a common trait. They all have the right Jesus.
Yeah, fair enough.
You see, contrary to Orthodox Christians or Christians, they have the right Jesus, and they have the right Jesus because they invented their own Jesus in order to befit their own goals.
Right. Yeah, I mean, so, yeah. But it's just odd that this whole discussion on Manichaeism, on the ELCHASAITES, on Gnosticism, all of it seems to always somehow touch on Islam and the Muslims. Scholars have been seeing this, as you saw, from the 1700s, they were noticing this. And they've been writing about it for decades, but no one wants to come out and say it openly. Except here. Any thoughts, Paul? You're nodding your head?
Yes, absolutely right. And I was very struck by what you said during the slides about it. It's a thought process. It's not necessarily one particular set of ideas. It's a way that you approach the material. I'm always attracted by anyone who looks at something and tries to figure out what the truth is, either historical truth, like we're doing here, or trying to find some spiritual truth or some moral truth in something, or just to play with an idea. But if you're heading towards something, the problem with these people who make up these stories is that they don't do that. They add layers and layers of flim flam that never takes you anywhere.
Hermeneutic. Remember, they're not grounded in the logos. They're not grounded in logic. They're grounded in narrative.
And that's why, you're absolutely right about the thought process. That's why we end up where we are today, when the 5 of us know so much more about the Quran or early Islam than any Muslim does, because they're not really interested in joining these discussions. They're not really interested in finding out anything. It's all about knowledge is power. How to try and use to make something up and then use it to control other people. So yes, I thought that's very instructive.
Yeah, ultimately, I met some Gnostics who don't even believe in some of the stuff themselves. Some of the stuff they believe is or that they pretend to believe, or that they tell their followers, is really, really ridiculous. And ultimately, the people who tell these stories, they don't even necessarily believe that themselves. That's not the point. That's not important. Right. The important thing to them is that the others believe it. And since they negate objective physical reality, as long as you have people believing it, that makes it real in their ideology.
Interesting. Tafsir Quran 10:5, Ibn Kathir, the days are revealed by the action of the sun, and the months and the years by the moon. Very interesting. There's a lot of moon stuff in Islam. If you do on Mondays, with JC, I'm doing a series called Monotheism about the pagan influences. And I mean, there's just so much of that stuff. It is insane how much moon stuff there is.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, JC, thoughts from you and Odan before we wind down here? We can call it a night, and then I can go next week. We can do the rest, or the week after, depending on it.
From me, I have to think about all of this. I don't know how to verbalize things correctly. So I always thought the Quran came first, and then because they start to build the story about Muhammad around that book, and then Islam happens. So we have the origins story of the book and the origins story of the religion are different, and I still believe that. But now I'm starting to think that maybe there is an ideology that is going around, a Gnostic ideology where they are borrowing from a lot of ideas, and the Quran gets used basically for their movement to try to unify things. Because even the way that the Quran is structured makes no sense. If it was one guy saying, this is a final revelation, it would be in order. Hence why Odon says it looks like notes from a preacher, but it looks like maybe the movement was first, people believing all of this silliness, and then they simply just use the book. Hence why they end up having in Sharia some of the things that are already happening. They don't create a new Sharia. They're taking the stuff from the guys that came before them. So now I need to think about how the pieces join together. If first comes the ideology, then the book gets used in the ideology, and then Islam comes at the back of it.
And Paul made a very good point. Remember, I discussed this on the last episode I did with you guys. I said, you need to understand that the third world mind thinks differently to the first world mind. I grew up in Africa, but I grew up with a first world education, let's say. So I simultaneously see the world in two distinct ways. I see it in the third world way, and I see it in the first world way. It's kind of a weird thing to try and explain to people. The third world mind sees the world differently. It calculates differently. So these people are seeing this through this Gnostic allegorical method. That's kind of how the third world works. It's not interested in logic and history. It's interested in narrative and feelings in a real sense. It's got a different set of calculus that it does on reality. So you're also applying this method of thinking, this way of thinking onto the data as well. That also influences how this data is perceived and expressed.
Yeah.
Odon, you're nodding your head there.
It's very, very interesting. But there are some other points that needs to be taken into account. Here we are talking about groups in Arabia, mostly in Arabia, maybe northern Arabia, but there were also other groups or other Arab groups.
Southern Arabia, like you're looking at Nazarenes as well.
Southern Arabia, but there were other groups in Syria, and I think they were very influenced. And the thing with what we are doing here, we are sort of unraveling all the ingredients in the soup. You see, in the concoction, like you said. But when we look at early Islam, we don't really see all these ingredients having an influence on these Arab factions.
Fair enough.
Is a very strong drive, which is connected to the expectations of the end times, of the Messianic times, and thereafter the idea that the Arabs will take will take over the whole world.
So when we get to the ELCHASAI, the next episode, finally, when I get to them, they were an apocalyptic Jewish Christian sect.
Yeah,
Like
exactly.
described
Exactly.
the
My
Nazarenes.
point here is that this what you showed us here, I think it is very important for the later development of Islam. Even though it was there at the beginning, I think that the main drive of Islam at the beginning was not about all these ideas. It was something else.
Yeah, I think
And
it
you
probably
see, if you
wasn't
look at the
formalized.
concoction, for example,
It
the
probably
idea of a
wasn't
soup. Let
formalized.
me just finish my point, Lloyd. You have a big cauldron with the soup and all the ingredients, and then you have a ladle whirling in the soup, which is the main drive. And at the beginning, it was the thing that was the most important. But in the end, the ingredients expressed all their flavors.
Agreed. I mean, if you look at the Quran, it seems to be Christian, Judaic in that vibe, right?
Yeah.
But then it's interpreted by a culture that is steeped in all of these other things.
Exactly.
So
I think that's exactly the thing. And besides, we also have to take into account that Islam eventually developed within a sort of civilized world, within the former Byzantine colonies and within the Persian Empire. And so it's very, very, it adds to the concoction. You see, you have all these ingredients plus a Byzantine framework, a Persian framework, and all of this ultimately made Islam.
yeah. Now we'll see more as I get into. I mean, I was putting down indirect things, and I'm trying to tie them together. So we'll start. But I'm trying to show that these influences were there. I mean, the Islamic record itself speaks of that Islamic practices are Sabaean practices, and Sabaean practices were Babylonian moon worship practices. You know. So you've got the practices, but then separately you have the beliefs. So you can also make a division there. There's these practices which come from a source based on ideas, and there's beliefs which are often totally different. And also they've reinterpreted the practices to say, no, we got this from here, but they're two separate sources, two different things. So there's a lot of confusion there. Any final word, Paul and JC, before I call it a night?
No, I think it's been fantastic. I look forward to finally reaching the ELCHASAIs.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting.
It's rather there's a prologue. We're coming to the end of the prologue.
Cool stuff, JC.
Yeah, I would like to actually play a little bit with the analogy from Odon. So we have a cold room and we are mixing the ingredients. So right now it's like we have on one table, we have lots of ingredients because we're putting them on the table. And then we also have the final product. And it's like, okay, if someone tells you, cook the same thing, you can't because you don't know the correct measures. But if you apply a number of things, scientific method, maybe you put the soup through some machines and it will tell you the percentages. Maybe you have a great palate and you can actually recognize it, or trial and error. You just try to cook it again and again and again until you come up with something that is that. And that's pretty much like what we are doing. We're putting all of those ingredients and then saying, okay, what is the correct mix that gives birth to Islam the way that it is 1400 years
and
later?
And also the sequence. What is the sequence?
Yeah.
You know, Odin's right. I mean, I'm not saying that I have the answer, but I'm trying to say, look, there's more information that fits, that's part of the recipe. We need to look at the quantities. We need to look at the sequence. We need to look at, the whole mix it's a weird mix, but I don't think we can casually dismiss these elements anymore.
Perhaps too many cooks spoil the broth, and that has been Islam's curse, I think.
Fair enough. Last word from you, Emmanuel. Let me call it a night. I need to run to the little boys' room.
No. I have nothing to add. All this talk about food makes me hungry.
All right. Just so you guys know, Emmanuel was raised in a cult, in a very Manichaean Gnostic cult. Oh. He escaped when he was younger, very young. And I actually have watched some of his videos on YouTube in the past. I didn't know him then. And then I don't know how we got connected, but I was researching some stuff, came across his videos. Meanwhile, he was researching my videos to learn about Gnosticism. So one of those weird things, and we somehow got connected. But yeah, that's a story for another time. So guys,
I watched your video about your videos about Gnosticism in Islam, and I was like, I recognize some of this stuff.
No, but that's good news. So yeah, guys, thank you very much for joining me. I really do appreciate it. Thank you to the audience. Yeah, Odon, there was a time you gave me a very hard time for any of these ideas. Now you're much more willing to, discuss. I like that.
I'm always open to discussion. Always. I'm not a prophet. I don't have a divine revelation.
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm not dismissing anyone else's ideas. I'm just saying maybe we need to consider additional ideas as well. Hopefully, I'm not being crazy. And I just wish Dan Gibson would come on and chat with us as well. I think sadly, but let's see what happens in the future. But yeah, would be great. Yeah. So guys, thanks all very much. It's been really fantastic. Next week, shall we do this? Or is it going to be Easter next week?
Yeah, next week.
Then we see you guys Wednesday. So guys, thank you very much.
Wednesday.
Really, I'm grateful. Good to have you all. Thanks to the audience. Have a wonderful Easter, everyone, and we shall see you all soon.